Good morning, everyone. Thank you. So many of you have returned. I'd love to see the hands of those that have been here all 4 days, because you're going to get a special thank you from all of us. Oh, Deborah. Okay, Deborah Mellist. Thank you, all 4 days. Liz Clem, all 4 days. Liz Toland, all 4 days. Christian Ward, all 4 days. Judy Kaplan, all 4 days. Ellen Wetzel, Ellen Bernstein, all 4 days. Amazing. And a special welcome today to Marvin Rapp, who has been participating many of the days. And Marvin is a member of the New Jersey Commission on Holocaust Education. And when we hear the name Rapp, we think of his parents. And we think about his mom, Esther Rapp, who survived Sophie Boer, and her survival is written about in Escape from Sophie Boer, which was made into a book. And since then, a play has been written and produced, and letters that children have written to Esther when she was with us, meaning alive, have been published in a book. If you'd like more information about that, please feel free to contact me. So welcome on board. Live from Jerusalem. I'm going to miss saying that tomorrow morning, but live from Jerusalem. And we have two presenters today, Jackie Metzger and Yoni Boris, and I'll talk about them in a minute, in particular about Jackie, who will be our first presenter. But I wanted to, because some of you were not with us prior days or only could come to another day, just give you a short recap that on our first day, Rob Rosette, senior historian of Yad Vashem, talked about icons of the Holocaust. And in 3-4 words, what did he say? He said, remember the human story. The dates are important, but the human story is even more important. And when we had the privilege of listening to Lori Gerson, who familiarized us with the Yad Vashem website, she too said, all of this website supports a human story. And if you haven't taken out time to explore the Yad Vashem website, I encourage you to do that. On day 2, we had Liz Ellsby, art educator, and Liz spoke about hearing the voices of the victims, remembering the victims, and viewing the art as not only a testimony, but a remembrance. Zechor, the Hebrew word for remember. And yesterday, we had the privilege of listening to Cheryl from Echoes and Reflections and Yad Vashem. And she spoke about the importance of photography and thinking about who took the picture, what was the purpose of the picture, and what can we see in the picture, and what voices can we hear. So that was Cheryl. And today we're going to begin with Jackie Metzger, the use of poetry in Holocaust education. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jackie in a minute, but I want to remind you that our workshop today is co-sponsored by Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum of Israel, based in Jerusalem, and all our presenters are from Jerusalem, and Echoes and Reflections, based in Jerusalem. At Stockton University, the Sarah and Sam Schofer Holocaust Resource Center, and the Sam Aziz Museum of Woodbine Heritage, which is located in Woodbine, New Jersey, part of Stockton University. Please, please, evaluations are so important to us because we find sponsors to fully fund these workshops. Please They look at our evaluations. They want to know how important, what did you learn? We will continue to encourage you. Please finish those those evaluations for us. As the prior 3 other days, we will not be taking a break, but take a break if you need to. But every presenter has had the following complaint: I didn't have enough time. I see Jackie laughing because Jackie's already anticipating that today. Yes, all of our voices are muted, and we encourage you to use the chat box. And we will, as best as possible, try to say who asked a particular question, who had, to give you recognition. And sometimes when we have a question, and that's what happened yesterday, we unmuted the participants so they could directly ask the presenter a question. We will continue, as we have every day, to record these presentations, and they will be available on our website in about 10 days. And I'm sure all of you have had the experience of going to a formal lecture, a formal experience, even via Zoom. These are informals. So relax, use your chat box, and I'm going to first introduce Dr. Mary Johnson. Mary, if you would give a wave and just a short hello to everyone. Can you unmute Mary, please? She's still not unmuted.
Am I unmuted now? I think I am.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's wonderful. Yes, I'm very much looking forward to Jackie today. I think that just as every day, what we've been learning are things that we can really integrate into our courses. And as I'm drawing up my syllabus right now, I'm thinking about so many things we've learned this week. So I look forward to Jackie's presentation. And please put the chats in. I think Jackie will sort of acknowledge when it's time to respond to the questions. Okay.
Thank you, Mary. And a short bio of Mary, very short, is that Mary, for many years, 30 plus years, I don't know the number, has been with Facing History and Ourselves. She is an expert educator. She has traveled throughout the country, facilitating workshops, seminars, and teaching teachers how to use the history from the past to make a better future for all of our students. And now, with pleasure, I want to introduce to you Jackie Metzger. Jackie is a teacher, but the kind of teacher that so many of us were and are. Jackie, for many years, taught in the high school system in Israel, and he was part of the kibbutz system there. I wondered, could you put in the chat box if you're a high school teacher? Just put high school teacher in the chat box so Jackie has an idea of how many high school teachers are here with us today. And then for 15 years, he transitioned. Just like so many of us, we've transitioned out of the high school, continuing to teach and to help other teachers. And he's been with Yad Vashem and Echoes and Reflections. And his expertise is history and English. Those are both of his degrees from Hebrew University. And look how he combined the two. So ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Jackie, where it is now 5 o'clock. Am I right? 4 o'clock in the afternoon?
10 past 4.
Say it again.
10 past 4.
10 past 4. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, as the sun will be setting soon in Jerusalem. Welcome, Jackie. And
Thank you, Gail.
we all look forward to learning from you.
Thank you so much, Gail. And before I even start, I just want to say how impressed I have been and have enjoyed working so far with Gail and with Morgan and with Irvin. And it's such a professional team and all the questions that I had about preparing and helping with the PowerPoint were immediately answered. So you people are very lucky out there at your university and in the organization where you are studying to have these people with you. Gail, can we start with the slide of the portraits? Oh, okay, echoes and reflections. I'll just mention echoes and reflections somewhat into the session because it's a very useful something that you could use to find materials in your teaching efforts. Let's move on to the portraits. Thank you. Another way to remember, meaning that we're going to be dealing with poetry and with mainly literature and poetry mainly, and you have here portraits. I just want to get my face out of the way, of 6 of the poets that I'm going to be bringing in the next hour or so. Maybe we'll get back to them. And if not, you can do your homework on the internet and find out who's who. And at this point, I'd like to get going. Gail, so if you can go down
Thank you.
Down to At the Mind's Limits, the next one. Thank you. So the plan is to discuss poetry and the Holocaust and use poetry as a means of accessing the experience of what it was to have gone through that. But strangely, I'm going to start with 2 pieces of short prose. What you have on the left is the cover of a book written by Jean Armory. Jean Armory wrote this book about 20 years after he was liberated from the Nazi camp system. He was born to a Catholic mother in Vienna, Austria in 1912, and a Jewish father. So technically, he actually wasn't Jewish. But after the Nuremberg trial, the Nuremberg laws, excuse me, the Nuremberg laws came out in 1935, he felt the Jewish identity coming forward because he together with all the Jews of Europe and all the Jews of the world, were being separated out by the Nuremberg laws. So let's read these, the short quote that I've prepared. Okay, I'll have to do it from paper because my pictures are covering. I had no clarity when I was writing this little book. I do not have it today, and I hope that I never will. Clarification would also amount to disposal, settlement of the case, which can then be placed in the files of history. My book is meant to aid in preventing precisely this. I rebel. I rebel against my past, against history, and against a present that places the incomprehensible in the cold storage of history and thus falsifies it in a revolting way. The quote speaks for itself. I'm not, everybody can feel the power of it. Just look at the dates that are added underneath. Jean Armory was liberated in 1945. The book was published about 20 years later, 1964. This quote is from the preface of a reissue in 1977, and then life was so difficult for him that he committed suicide 1 year later. So what we're talking about is the fact that clarification is something that for Armory was very difficult to arrive at. And he didn't actually want it to be, that for him would have been disposal. The cold storage of history, and he wanted to avoid that with all his might. So from Armory, Jean Armory, if you'll move on with me, Morgan, can you, thank you. Aaron Alperfault died a few years ago. He was born in 1932. He went through the Holocaust more or less on his own as a little kid. He managed to survive. he didn't know that his father had also survived. And he met him in Israel about shortly after he had made it back here. He made it here, he made it to the land of Israel in 1945, 1946. And he wrote many, many novels over the next 40, 50 years. Here's a line of Aaron Alperfault. When it comes to describing reality, art always demands a certain intensification. However, this is not the case with the Holocaust. Everything in it already seems so thoroughly unreal, as if it no longer belongs to the experience of our generation, but to mythology. Thence comes the need to bring it down to the human realm. When I say bring it down, I do not mean to simplify, to attenuate, or to sweeten the horror, but to attempt to make the events speak through the individual and in his language. Well, I think that's what your seminar has been doing for the last 3 days and today as well. You've spoken, you've heard lectures about icons and about art and about paintings and about photographs. And after I'm bringing poetry and Yoni's going to bring films. And I think this way, especially in addition, of course, through my sphere, which is poetry and literature, we are going to get to the individual. And when we read a poem, and we're going to be doing 6 or 7 poems, I think you get to the heartfelt artistic expression of what these people went through. So we can talk about experience, we can talk about feeling the texture of a trauma, possibly, the rawness of exposure to what had happened in Europe between 1939 and 1945. And I think we can approach the immediacy of what had happened during those years perhaps more easily than reading the historical accounts, which of course we need completely. I'll talk about that a little bit later. So from the 2 pieces of prose, we are going to move on to the first poem. Thank you, Morgan. One word about W.H. Auden. Note that he wrote this poem in 1939. He actually wrote it at the beginning of 1939. So we're talking about 7, 8 months before the outbreak of the war, which is going to be September. W.H. Auden was a British poet laureate. He was extremely well known. And in the early 30s, he moved to Berlin because Auden led an alternative lifestyle. He was a homosexual. And one of the difficult places to be living in the 1930s was England. So where do you go? Which is the driving, the hopping center of Europe in these years, in the 30s, before the Nazis come to power? It's Berlin. So he went to Berlin, and he's living there in the early 30s and on. And it gets too hot for him in 1938 and 39, and he got the hell out. He went to the United States of America, and eventually, well, he wrote this poem 6 months or 7 months before the war. And if I didn't mention it, maybe I should, he was not Jewish. So I'll read the poem. Say the city has 10 million souls, some are living in mansions, some are living in holes. Yet there is no place for us, my dear. Yet there's no place for us. Once we had a country and we thought it fair. Look in the atlas and you'll find it there. We cannot go there now, my dear. We cannot go there now. In the village churchyard, there grows an old yew. Every spring it blossoms anew. Old passports can't do that, my dear. Old passports can't do that. The consul banged the table and said, if you've got no passport, you're officially dead. But we're still alive, my dear. But we're still alive. Went to a committee, they offered me a chair, asked me politely to return next year. But where shall we go today, my dear? But where shall we go today? Came to a public meeting, the speaker got up and said, if we let them in, they'll steal our daily bread. He was talking of you and me, my dear. He was talking of you and me. Thought I heard the thunder rumbling in the sky. It was Hitler over Europe saying we must die. We were in his mind, my dear. We were in his mind. Saw a poodle in a jacket fastened with a pin. Saw a door opened and a cat let in. But they weren't German Jews, my dear. They weren't German Jews. Went down to the harbor and stood upon the quay. Saw the fish swimming as if they were free. Only 10 feet away, my dear. Only 10 feet away. Walked through a wood, saw the birds in the trees. They had no politicians and sang at their ease. They weren't the human race, my dear. They weren't the human race. Dreamed us all building with 1,000 floors, 1,000 windows and 1,000 doors. Not one of them was ours, my dear. Not one of them was ours. Stood on a great plain in the falling snow. 10,000 soldiers marched to and fro, looking for you and me, my dear, looking for you and me. I have to go back. First of all, I want to say something about the lineation of the poem. Lineation of poetry is extremely important. Normally, the poem appears, and you'll find it on the internet, with a break after every 3 lines. So it's broken up into 3 lines, 3 lines, 3 lines. We couldn't do that here exactly because of the trying to fit it in on one slide. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take you back to, I think we had an introduction yesterday from Russ Siegel. Is that correct, Gail? Russ Siegel spoke to you at the beginning of the session yesterday, or maybe the day before, and he asked a question about if anybody knew how many refugees there were in the world today, 2020. And the answer that we got from Russ, and maybe somebody on the screen, one of the participants, was around 80 million. And what I'm going to do right now is read you one line. I don't know if you can see this book clearly. Written by Tony Judd, a great historian who died a few years ago, unfortunately. And he wrote, one of the last books he wrote was post-war. I'm going to read you 2 lines from it. Between them, Stalin and Hitler uprooted, transplanted, expelled, deported, and dispersed some 30 million people in the years 1939 to 1943. 30 million. And Russ Siegel told us that we're up to 80 million today. And he used a phrase that I even wrote down because I thought it was so apt. He said, something's not working. That's what he said. And he's dead right. Something is not working in the world today. If we can, after the experience of the Second World War, with the legacy that we got from Stalin and from Hitler, move from 30 million refugees to 80 million refugees today, I think we're in a spot of trouble. And that's why, the encouragement that somebody like me at the end of my career can get from a seminar like this is that so many young people have decided to go into education. And this is a poem that's dealing with the problem of refugees. It's an endemic problem even before we start with the Second World War. I'm not talking about murder. Auden's not talking about murder. He's talking about what's waiting around the corner. And that's why I recommend, also on the website of Yad Vashem that Laurie presented to you, there's a lot of stuff that I've written that's up there connected with poetry and the Holocaust. And I have a lesson plan there of 1.5 hours that can be done at different levels for different classes. You're welcome to go into the website and find different ideas. But I'm going to move on because I keep on looking at the watch. Connected with refugee blues, before we go to some more poetry, is a photograph. Thank you. Thank you, Morgan. Look at that photograph. Liz might have spoken about Felix Nussbaum yesterday. She probably did. Did she, Gail? I would imagine that she mentioned Felix Nussbaum. Look at a picture of the refugee. He called it
Yes,
the
Liz
refugee.
did speak about this, and we spent about 10 minutes with it. And yes, to answer your other question, it was Professor Dr. Raz Siegel that you were quoting before.
Okay, thank you. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it because Liz did yesterday, but maybe there are some people with you today that weren't around yesterday. So just look at it. You've got the picture of a depressed person sitting at the end of an awful room, and he's got his little package for wandering the world. But he's just been looking at the globe. If you turn that globe around, nobody was ready to receive him. On the left-hand side, you've got a window or a door to the open, and if you can see, there are some birds flying. So you can interpret those birds as birds of prey, or you can interpret the world of birds are free to fly wherever they want, and the refugee is stuck, and he's not going to go anywhere. So that's a painting that could also be used in the classroom to help the student understand the plight of the refugee. And I'd like to move on from Felix Nussbaum. He, of course, became a victim in Auschwitz in 1944. I'm sure that Liz mentioned that yesterday. And what we have here, thank you, Morgan, is a photograph. So we're using photographs, we're using paintings, we're using poetry, and we're trying to get to the individual. What it says here is Berlin, Germany, 1939, Jews waiting in line in front of a travel agency. What I did not mention, and you probably know this from your studies or from your reading, is that the beginning of January 1939, when W.H. Auden is writing this poem, is about 2 months after Kristallnacht. Kristallnacht was that awful, awful event when many of the Jews of Germany realized that this was actually the end. And many of them were thrown out of Germany across the border into Poland. They were stuck there for a while, including parts of my family, and until they were allowed into Poland, which of course wasn't going to be much of a saving grace later on in the story. But you have here basically the poem of Auden that's dealing with this problem of people that are begging to become refugees. You've got the painting and you've got the photograph. So it's different ways of approaching an endemic problem that we're facing today, as Raz Siegel pointed out to us yesterday, and Mr. Auden was writing about, W.H. Auden was writing about even before the war broke out. So that's the first poem. And we're going to move on to a group of 3 poems. Excuse me. I'm just going to give you a few words about Charlotte Delbo. She was a non-Jewish resistance fighter in France. She belonged to the art world. She had, I think she was married actually, or she had a partner about to get married. She had gone with her theater group to South America. War broke out. She heard that her partner had been arrested, and she raced back from South America to Paris. The partner was shot. She was sent to Auschwitz, and she survived about 1.5 years in Auschwitz. She wrote a book. Well, here we have it in the French, Auschwitz and After. Thank you, Morgan. Morgan's something unusual. Auschwitz and After, and this is part of a poem. I'm going to read it. Today people know, have known for several years, that this dot on the map is Auschwitz. This much they know. As for the rest, they think they know. Charlotte Delbo. This poem is short enough for me to read it again, and that's what I always recommend, by the way, methodological statement in brackets that I'm suggesting. Don't read a poem once in a classroom. Have a student read it after you've read it, or another student. Get it from different voices because everybody emphasizes different aspects. I'm going to read it again. Today people know, have known for several years, that this dot on the map is Auschwitz. This much they know. As for the rest, they think they know. So Charlotte Delbo, maybe I should just add this before I make one or two statements about this poem. I don't want to go in great depth. Charlotte Delbo, in her book, Auschwitz and After, it's one of the hardest books that I've ever picked up on the Holocaust. She's got poetry that I have to force myself to read. But I think that it behooves us to read all this difficult poetry. And let's remember for a moment that she wasn't a Jewish survivor and victim in the end. All the survivors were victims. It just took them longer to become victims. She was non-Jewish, and she had to suffer what the Nazis had visited upon the whole of Europe. So let's look at the poem for a second. There's one word that repeats 4 times. I just read that from Mary Johnson, thank you. Lawrence Langer finds Delbo one of the most important voices and often quotes her. Thank you, Mary. The word that repeats 4 times is no, known, no. And in the last line again, they think they know. So what's Charlotte Delbo suggesting? She's talking about the problem of knowledge. Look, so much history has been written. We have an incredible debt to all the historians that have presented us with the facts. We know about the gas chambers, we know about the death camps, we know about the ghettos, we know about the concentration camps. We know about the number of trains that traveled, we know how many people were squashed. We know. And what Charlotte Delbo is telling us is that as for the rest, they think they know. So I think what she's trying to tell us is that there's no way for somebody who wasn't there to penetrate into the experience of having been there. And I want to point out one other thing before I move on to another poem, to the next poem, because I'm making a small unit of this poem and another 2. Look what she's written in the 3rd line. Today, people have known for several years that this dot on the map is Auschwitz. She has reduced what some of the historians have termed the concentration camp universe. She has reduced a whole universe to a dot on a map. And then, of course, the question of the knowledge. So what we have here again, I think, is a question of perspective. What kind of perspective do I have of the Holocaust? I was born 1 year after the end of the war, so I wasn't there. I was born into a family of survivors. But if I have time at the end of the session, I'll be prepared to talk about that. Because I never heard about the Holocaust at home, as opposed to Leo Schoffer, who spoke on the first day, I think. And he said that he heard from his Lithuanian parents day in and day out, and they spoke about the Holocaust. I didn't hear one word at home. It was a subject that didn't exist. So what you have here at the edge of my tongue is that different families and different survivors dealt differently with the problem of the baggage, the emotional baggage that they were carrying. Some talked about it, some wrote about it, and others couldn't do it at all. So I want to do 2 more poems, and then I'm going to ask a question, and we'll see if we can get some discussion up there. Mary, is that good? Right. Morgan, move us on. Thank you very much. The Polish poet that you have up there, Wisława Szymborska, passed away several years ago. Let me find her date. She was born in Poland in 1923, and she died in 2012. She received the Nobel Prize in 1998. I'm absolutely in love with this lady's poetry, but here's a poem that is tough. So let's look at it, because what I'm talking about in the previous poem and this poem and the next poem is a question of trauma. This poem's got nothing to do with the Holocaust. As you can see, we're talking about 9/11. We're talking about the trauma of what happened in New York on 9/11. So here's her poem, photographed from September the 11th. And on the left-hand side, it's not very clear. You've got a photograph. And you've probably all seen that photograph. Of course, we've seen movies. So here you have a combination of poetry and photographs and movies. that present this question of trauma and how we deal with it. I'll read the poem. They jumped from the burning floors. 1, 2, a few more, higher, lower. The photograph halted them in life and now keeps them above the earth, towards the earth. Each is still complete with a particular face and blood well hidden. There's enough time for hair to come loose, for keys and coins to fall from pockets. There is still within the air's reach, within the compass of places that have just now opened. I can do only 2 things for them. Describe this flight and not add a last line. I'm not going to read the whole poem again. I'm just going to read the last 3 lines again, and then we're going to go on to the next poem, and then I'm going to ask the question. I can do only 2 things for them. I can describe this flight and not add a last line. Morgan, please move us on from Wisława Szymborska. Thank you. To Dan Puggies, written in pencil in the sealed railway car. Dan Puggies, maybe just a word about Dan Puggies before I read the poem. Was born in 1930 in the area of Romania. In 1941, he was 11 years old. He travels with his grandparents into his story of the Holocaust. He survived forced labor camps, which he never, ever spoke about, not even with his wife. And he came to the land of Israel as a young boy, teenager of 15, 16 after the war, and became a leading professor of medieval Jewish literature at the Hebrew University. He was dearly loved by his pupils. Born in 1930, died in 1986, and Dan Puggies was depressed. And maybe if I have time, I'll add something more about that a little bit later. But he, just behind my laptop, I have a book of all his poems in Hebrew. They are something else. This poem has become an icon. Rob spoke about icons. In Hebrew literature, there virtually isn't a pupil in the state of Israel today that doesn't get this poem from his literature teacher. It's an icon. So the poem, as you're looking at it, is complete. I repeat that, it's complete. It's one of the shortest poems on the Holocaust, and it also is, for me, one of the ultimate poems on the Holocaust, with so much hiding between the lines, between the words, between the letters, that you have to, I'm going to say this, maybe I feel a little uncomfortable about it, but I suggest you go into the website of Yad Vashem under Poetry, find a lesson plan that I wrote about this, which includes the 4 verses from the book of Genesis, chapter 4, that talk about the subject that she's using, Dan Puggies is using to penetrate the experience. I'll read the poem. Written in pencil in the sealed railway car. Here in this carload, I am Eve, with Abel my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that I'll read it again. Here in this carload, I am Eve, with Abel my son. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that Tell him that what? So, in 1 minute, Mary, I'm going to phrase a question. But what I want to point out is something that I did not point out. Very often, poets give us the punchline, not always, give us the punchline at the end of a poem. And I'm suggesting that if you go through these 3 poems, Charlotte Delbo, Wisława Szymborska, and this poem of Dan Puggies, you have got a powerful punchline at the end of each poem that amongst those punchlines, you have a common denominator. That's the question. What is the common denominator that you can pick out from Delbo, from Szymborska, and from this short, unbelievable poem of Dan Puggies? That's the question, Mary, that I'm posing, and if you can
Right.
handle the chats.
We're beginning to, before we go to your question, Judy Vogel had a comment that I think she wants to share. Judy? She unmute there? I'm not sure. She's not there now. Okay, let's go to the question. I think as someone said haunting, chilling. Who wants to attempt the question though? Pose there. Of bringing those four, what do we bring from the four? Why haunting? Why chilling? Incomplete open thought, Barbara. Barbara, do you want to go a little further on that? I don't know if you can they open you up? Yeah. Okay. There is, oh, here. Thomas Sheridan, that there was no way for us to understand, which is something I think you've already suggested a couple of times. And Lay has a wonderful, what is known or unknown language? So maybe, I wonder if you could elaborate a little on that. Sort of what is the known and unknown language, the poet? I wonder, Jackie, if you could just make a couple of comments a little bit more about Pagus and his bio and why you've been so interested in his work, especially the poem that you just used. So can you tell us a little bit more about Pagus? That your website has quite a bit about him, so I'm just wondering if you could flesh that out a little bit.
I can. You want me to do that before we get back to the common denominator?
Okay, let's do the common denominator and then we'll go to that. Yeah, okay. We're getting lots of, let's see, the unknown. It leaves it, here's Karen, it leaves it open for the reader to finish or to contemplate, reflect, which is so essential throughout these pieces. And then here, it's Kristen says, let the reader finish the poem. And I'm wondering, when you work with this, with students, do you sometimes let them actually try to finish a poem or read,
sure,
sort of
Mary,
create their own sound poems?
For sure, Mary. That's definitely one of the suggestions we always make to teachers, to have their pupils or their students or even the adults that might be in a class finish the message that Untitled was unable to put into the mouth of Eve. Because he was unable to do it. And look, the comments that have come in are very good comments, but I'm suggesting the person finishes the message with how they feel about others. Correct. That's right. But the point that I want to make here is that the three poets who went through two of them went through the experience, and Szymborska was growing up as a teenager and an 18-year-old, 19-year-old. She saw all the suffering in Poland. I mean, she didn't go through the Holocaust herself, but the Polish population certainly suffered. And
that's a transmission of trauma then, I guess.
That's it. That's the point. That the poets themselves that went through these difficult times, they couldn't formulate. They can't formulate what it is to go through a trauma like that. So it's a very good idea, especially with the Untitled poem. If you see my other son, Cain, son of man, tell him that I what? What did Untitled want Eve to tell us? She's in a car load, she's going with her son Abel, who's just been murdered by Cain. Of course, you have this, you have to look at the 4 verses in the book, chapter 4 of the book of Genesis. And you get the whole thing together. That's on the website of Yad Vashem. I've done that.
So you would you suggest actually using that in conjunction with Pagus, with the poem? You actually having that with that, or you have it in your on with your lesson ideas? So would you include that? I don't know if you can hear
Using
me.
what?
You said you had pieces from the Bible that you actually put in with that. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Absolutely. On the website of Yad Vashem, in the lesson plan that I've written.
Right in the lesson, you use that as a way to have them. Okay.
Yeah, yes. There are 4 verses there. There are 4 verses in in chapter 4 of the book of Genesis that describe the relationship between Cain and Abel. And they have to, because there's no question, Dan Puggies was a professor of literature. And I'm going to go to the other question that you asked, Mary. I'll elaborate just a little bit more on Dan Puggies, although we have another poem. Maybe we'll keep that for the next
and
poem
I
of Dan
would
Puggies.
like to ask Judy Vogel, and I'm so proud to say, Irvin, if you would unmute Judy, that Judy was my student.
Yeah, sorry, my mouse wasn't working. I had to go get a new one.
Okay, so Judy, your words are very powerful that you put in the chat, and we know that you've been teaching Holocaust studies for I don't know how many years. You'll share that with us. But again, I want to say, look how you plant the seeds and you never know where they'll grow. Judy was a math major here at Stockton and said very proudly, I'm going to go on to earn my PhD in mathematics, and she did. And she is well published and a well-known mathematician, but she also teaches Holocaust studies for us. And Judy, if you would share your comment with us, very important.
I just wanted to say, Jackie, that when you started by saying that with the disclaimer that you don't use the poetry to soften the events, I really appreciated that, and how you use it to emphasize the content and to give the victims a voice. And I just wrote that I found when I'm working with poetry that the students are already in a higher emotional state when they read poetry. There's something about poetry that brings out emotion in us as human beings. And so because of that, I find the material that's presented through poetry to be even more impactful. So even though it's considered a softer voice and how we communicate with each other, the emotion it raises is heightened, and it becomes more impactful. So, thank you,
Judy. I'm very encouraged to hear that report from you. Thank you so much.
You know, I wonder if Leanne could just elaborate on her comment too, which she brings up, also thinking about how Wiesel in Night finds it so difficult to find the language. Leanne, can they unmute you or whatever?
Yes, Leanne Toddy, we will unmute you.
Oops. Did we get her? I picked the wrong one. Okay. Unmute? Okay.
It has been sent to her, but.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
While we're waiting for Leanne, I think Randy has a really important comment too, in terms of this whole question of feeling completely connected versus isolation. I can't see the rest of your comment there. Maybe while we're waiting for Leanne, maybe Randy could just elaborate a little bit on her comment.
Well, I can read it for you if you can.
Yeah, okay.
Because it's hard to go back and forth on muting.
I see, okay.
And sometimes folks have a hard time doing that. So within the context written in the car, the comparison to far back history in the moment, feeling is connected versus isolation, oddly.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I'd like to now throw it back to Jackie to continue
Jackie.
on what
I just have a quick question just a quick question for Jackie before we go on. When you're reading the poetry in classes, Jackie, do you sometimes have students read them, or do you read them, or how do you do that in the class for them to try to sort of hear it and then go back over it with you and reflect on it? How do you do it in the class?
Okay, Mary, thanks for the question. And whenever I can, if it's not too long, like the first poem of W.H. Auden is a long poem, right? But a poem like this, I'll ask a student if he's happy to read it. I'll read it. Another student. And short poems like this, I like to have read about 2 or 3 times in a classroom. Again, because I believe that everybody who reads a poem reads it with different emphases. And you might have another access route into a poem by somebody else's reading. So yes, I do have it read more than once, if possible.
Thank
you.
Let's go
Jackie,
back.
we're going to go back to you.
Yes.
Thank you, Jackie.
Okay, so am I continuing?
Yes.
Yes, please.
Oh, okay. There's one more thing that I want to mention about this poem specifically. And of course, again, there's so much on the website about it. But where do you have Holocaust? You only have Holocaust in one word that actually repeats. It's in the railway car, a sealed railway car, and in the first line, carload. What did Dunpugis do? Dunpugis, who was an expert in displacement, because it was so difficult for him to write about it, displaced the tragedy of the Holocaust. 6 million Jews out of 8.5 million Jews living in Europe by using the story from chapter 4 of Genesis. The story of the first murder on earth. Cain murders Abel. There are 4 people on earth. One brother murders the other. And from then, 4 Dunpuggies. The history of mankind. And I think I said this at the beginning. He wasn't a very happy individual. And I know that from his wife because I interviewed his wife in the last 5 years. Although he was an excellent teacher and his pupils loved him. But he lived with this feeling that it could happen again. And he wasn't able to formulate the last line. He couldn't put the words into Eve's mouth. He couldn't put the words into his own mouth. So he went to the first murder on earth, 4 people on earth, and one brother murders the other. And for Puggies, the history of mankind was the uninterrupted murder from the biblical era to the mass murder of the 20th century. I would like to move on to the next poem of Dunpuggies. And then, Mary, I'll give a little bit more information about that Dunpuggies, because I'm looking at the watch. And Gail,
Yes, please.
that was very nice group discussion, Gail. That was nice group discussion. And therefore, I'm going to take some time from the question and answer period just to finish another 1 or 2 poems after the next poem. Let's move on to testimony, please, Morgan. Another poem. And let me just say that this poem and the one before, the first poems that Dunpuggies wrote about the Holocaust were in 1970, 25 years after he came out of his story of the Holocaust. 1945, end of the war, 1970. Testimony. No, they definitely were human beings. Uniforms, boots. How do you explain? They were created in the image. I was a shade. A different creator made me. And he in his mercy left nothing of me that would die. And I fed to him. I rose weightless, blue, forgiving. I would even say apologizing. Smoke to omnipotent smoke without image or likeness. So I dare say that this is a difficult poem. It's a poem that I'll definitely won't read once in a classroom. I'll have it read a few times. And Gail or Mary, if somebody would like to actually read it, Irvin, is that possible? Can we unmute somebody who wants
Yes,
to read
I'm
this poem again?
unmuted, but I would love, I had seen Jane Stark. Jane, would you like to read it? You're
Great,
such a
yes.
great reader. Jane, are you there? Let's see if Jane is there.
Are you here? Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Yes, we
can.
can hear you. Right.
Okay. All right. No. They definitely were human beings. Uniforms, boots. How to explain? They were created in the image. I was a shade. A different creator made me. And he in his mercy left nothing of me that would die. And I fled to him, rose weightless, blue, forgiving, I would even say, apologizing, smoke to omnipotent smoke, without image or likeness.
Thank you. That was Jane, right? Jane?
That
Yes,
was Jane.
Jane Stark, yes.
Thank you very much.
And
Nice reading.
Jackie, would you just explain to us that funny writing on the right-hand side of the poem?
Yeah, the writing on the right-hand side, I'm sorry, is Hebrew. So I thank you for the question, because you reminded me, and it's important, and I'm actually going to bring up a point connected with this, that Dan Puggies wrote all his poetry in his new adopted language. He started writing several years after he landed here in 1946 in Hebrew. And there are other poets, other survivors that would not write in Hebrew. They wrote in Yiddish and in other languages that they grew up in. And a famous one, who didn't come to the land to Israel, Portugal, actually wrote in German, because he said, the Germans not only murdered my parents, but they also murdered the German language. So I'm going to resurrect the German language for them. And he wrote his difficult poetry. Some of it is difficult, some of it is absolutely stunning. And we're not doing any of it today, unfortunately, in German. So what I want to say about the translation here is the following. I'm going to read it again. No, they definitely were human beings. Uniforms, boots, how to explain? They were created in the image, period. Obviously, he's talking about the image of God. Who was created in the image of God? The Germans who were wearing uniforms and boots. Now, before I carry on and get to the question of translation, I want you to look at the name of the poem, Testimony. Where do you give testimony? Testimony is given in a court of law. So the question that I'm going to ask, and I'm looking at the clock again. The question that I'm asking, who is Dan Puggies putting on the accused bench, because we're in a court of law? Testimony is being given here. So let's go back. No, they definitely were human beings. Uniforms, boots, how to explain? They were created in the image. Delineation, there's a break. I was a shade, and that's a translation. And there are other translations, and I actually prefer another translation. The word is a shadow. I was a shadow. A different creator made me. Misaligned. And he in mercy left nothing of me that would die. And I fled to him, rose weightless, blue, forgiving. I would even say apologizing, smoke to omnipotent smoke without image or likeness. Now, Gail and Mary, I'm asking you, I'm looking at the clock and it's 5 o'clock. I'm going to skip the next poem and I'm going to do the last poem of Primo Levy, because I know what Cheryl said to you yesterday. If she couldn't put up the one last picture, she was going to go home crying. Well, she was at home.
No,
So
please do
I don't
your
want
next
to go
poem.
home crying.
Right.
So
I want to do
we
the
have
last,
30 minutes left.
Okay.
with 30 minutes left, so let's do 10 minutes for another few statements about this
Right.
poem. And unfortunately, you know, if we were in a classroom, we could talk about this for a long time. But it's a little bit uncomfortable doing it like this. And I'm going to suggest to you a few ideas and then move on to the last poem.
Thank you.
Just before we race, why the word shadow rather than shade? Is that more how it would be translated in the Hebrew, or what? Why do you prefer? Yeah.
The Hebrew word is tzel. Well, doesn't matter. And you could translate it as shade. But if you say shadow, shadow is something that you can't touch. It's totally insubstantial. A shade, you can touch a shade, but you can't touch a shadow. And the next line, a different creator made me. What is Dan Puggies talking about? You know, if you take the three monotheistic religions of Judaism and Christianity and Islam, there's one creator for the three monotheistic religions. And if he talks about a different creator, he's going back to Babylonian times when you had different gods for different, you had a god for the mountains, and you had a god for the valleys, and you had a god for the lightning, and you had a god for this and a god for that. A different creator made me. So what is he actually saying about this different creator? And then I'm going to ask the question about the tone of the poem. How about the next line? And he in his mercy left nothing of me that would die, and I fled to him, rose weightless, blue because I'm already dead, forgiving, I would even say apologizing, and here you have another theme of survivors apologizing for surviving. So unfortunately, we can't go. I'm just picking out one or two possibilities. Smoke to omnipotent smoke, and I'm without image or likeness to the omnipotent. So if I go back to that question, and I've had very interesting experiences with rooms of Polish teachers and different classes. Who's on the accused bench? And I've had answers, all different kinds of answers. And so that I can move on to the last poem, I'm just going to tell you the following. About 5 years ago, I phoned up his widow, Mrs. Ada Pagis. She lives in Jerusalem. And I asked her if she would receive me because I teach at Dan Pagis at Yad Vashem, and I've got questions. And she shouted at me on the phone. She said, read my book. And I said, Mrs. Pagis, please, I'm holding your book and I've got it marked from beginning to end, and I've still got questions. So she accepted me into her house. And I had 2 wonderful hours talking with Mrs. Pagis about Dan Pagis. And when I asked her the question, did Dan believe? The answer was in the negative. So what I'm suggesting on the grounds of that what Dan Pagis was doing in this poem was that the experience of the Holocaust and the story of 6 million out of 8.5, 9 million Jews living in Europe murdered was too much for him in terms of thinking about a theodicy, about the existence of a God. And he put God onto the accused bench. So unfortunately, we can't. We don't have time to discuss it. And I'm going to ask Morgan to skip the Amichai poem. We can do it later after I have a whiskey. And you people are going to be having lunch after Yoni Beros. Let's do Shema by Primo Levy. I'll tell you just 1.5 sentences about Primo Levy. He was a young Jew fighting with the partisans in northern Italy. He was caught in 1943. He was shipped off to Auschwitz. He survived 10 months in Auschwitz, and he's known primarily for the books that he wrote and not the poetry that he wrote. So one of the books that he wrote, in your country, it's actually published under the name Survival in Auschwitz. Another name, the British Penguin, is If This Is a Man. Should have received the Nobel Prize by my thinking, but as you can imagine, nobody asked me. So he didn't get the Nobel Prize. And he wrote this poem called Shema. Now the word Shema is the Hebrew word for listen, and it's the first word of the central prayer in the Jewish liturgy that is said by an observant Jew 2 or 3 times a day, every day, including the Sabbath. Shema, listen, and I'm going to read it. You who live secure in your warm houses, who return at evening to find hot food and friendly faces, consider whether this is a man who labors in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or a no. Consider whether this is a woman without hair or name, with no more strength to remember, eyes empty and womb cold as a frog in winter. Consider that this has been. I commend these words to you. Engrave them on your heart when you are in your house, when you walk on your way, when you go to bed, when you rise. Repeat them to your children, or may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, and your offspring avert their faces from you. The correct lineation for this poem, it's been squashed into the slide, is the first 4 lines, and then a break, and then about 10 lines, and then consider that this has been. So I'm going down to consider that this has been. Everybody with me? I commend these words to you. The next 4 lines come from that prayer that is said by every religious Jew at least twice a day. I commend these words to you. Engrave them on your hearts when you're in your house, when you walk in your way, when you go to bed, when you rise, and repeat them to your children. So Primo Levi, who was also not a religious Jew, but he also knew the liturgy, just like Dan Puggies knew the liturgy and everything that went together with it. They were highly intelligent and well-read human beings, was invoking the central prayer to tell us the last 4 lines. Repeat them to your children. In your case, as teachers, you're repeating them to your classrooms. And then the last 3 lines, the most awful 3 lines in the poem for me. Because this is where his threat is. If you don't repeat them to your children, if you don't talk about the Holocaust, may your house crumble, disease render you powerless, and your offspring, the worst one, your offspring avert their faces from you. What we don't have here is that this poem was written in January 1946. Primo Levi had been liberated from Auschwitz in January 1945. So he's been out for a year and he's spilling this out. He wants it spoken about. He wants it talked about because he was afraid that it would be forgotten or distorted, and the importance of what had actually happened, this transgressive event in the history of humankind there in Europe, and mainly in Europe, would not find its place, or would find its place in the cold storage of history. I'm going back to the beginning of the session with Jean-Marie, the cold storage of history. If you don't talk about it, if you don't teach it, if you don't get it out there, which is what you people are doing because you volunteered to come to the seminar of Gales. Nobody forced you. So you're a captive audience and you're doing what has to be done according to Primo Levi. And I think I'm going to end with that, Gail, and ask if there are any questions because it's now 5:10. And Yoni Barros is getting nervous. I can see that.
No, I just wonder if you might mention a little about Primo Levi's ending. He too seemed to feel that he couldn't get that message. Somehow he was frustrated by it. And I believe about a decade after Pagis, Primo Levi also committed suicide.
I can go there, Mary. Before I go there, I just want to add one more thing because it's a curious fact. Jean-Marie, in that book that we started with, At the Man's Limits, he mentions the fact that he shared a barracks in Auschwitz with Primo Levi. So Jean-Marie and Primo Levi were in the same hut, they were in the same barracks, and they suffered together. And they were able to talk about, the place of intellectuals in Auschwitz, that's a whole other subject. We won't go into it. It's actually at the core of his book, At the Limits of the Mind. Mary, just repeat your question again.
It wasn't so much a question, but he also seemed unable to deal with the fact that he couldn't get that message out, especially when he would go into classrooms, as I understood, that he was frustrated with how students couldn't quite get it and understand what he was trying to say. But
very, very much so. Look,
I have a question from Barry Kopp. How
Gail,
accurate?
Gail, 1 second. Let me just answer Mary.
Sure.
I could give you a not short list, unfortunately, of these people that went through the experience of the Holocaust and committed suicide after writing about it. So Paul Celan was 49 years old when he jumped into the Seine River in Paris. And that was about 6 months after he'd visited and met all his friends here in Jerusalem. And he went back to Paris and he committed suicide, 49 years old. The leading poet in the German language after the Holocaust. Paul Celan, Primo Levi, 1986, committed suicide. I didn't want to go there because some of the historians actually dispute that. But the evidence kind of points in the direction that he was really, really depressed with what was going on, and he took his own life. For others, Jean-Marie committed suicide. Well, you had that in the first slide in 1978. Dan Pagis did not commit suicide. He died a sick man in Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem, but he was only 56 years old. So the experience of the Holocaust had actually eaten away his self-confidence. Yes,
Very,
Gail.
yeah.
I would
and very
like to move on to questions, Mary.
Yeah, but I
And let's, Mary,
Okay.
so we have time for, sorry.
I was just going with Barry Koff's question
Yes,
about
please.
how accurate translations are in the works written in the different in individual language. I mean, did it change some of what we understand from Pagas from him writing in Hebrew? I think Barry's question is excellent. So see if you can.
And I encourage everyone to please write questions in the chat box.
Okay, so did you formulate a question for me, Mary?
Yes. Barry Koff asks, how accurate are the translations when the work is written in the individual language?
The translations that are brought of these poems here are pretty accurate. They're good translations by my reading, except for that one word that I would change, possibly shade for shadow for shade. But they are good.
You have some other questions? Right.
Gail, you've got another one?
Yes, I was writing my question, so I'll just verbally say it. Can you share with us an uplifting poem? I always want to make sure when I'm teaching my students that at the very end, I share with them from despair comes hope. And so I wondered, and I am putting you on the spot, but I wondered if there was something that you would suggest to us that can uplift our students.
You are putting me on the spot, and I don't know if this is going to answer your question. I'm going to show you a book that I have here. I prepared a few books next to me. A Polish poet. I don't know if that's clear. His name is Sergio Rosevich. And the last time that I did a Zoom for Echoes and Reflections for Cheryl, it was about a month ago, I did present this poem. He was a Catholic Pole. He fought in the Polish resistance. He lived a long life. He became a very popular poet in Poland. And every kid in Poland learns this poem. And I know that from the Polish desk at Yad Vashem. Okay? I'm going to read it.
Thank you.
It's called The Survivor. But afterwards, Gail, you have to tell me if there's any optimism here.
I would love folks to put that in the chat box. So can you pose the question again so we ask us the question what you would like us to answer?
Do you intuit any optimism in this poem? Okay, I'm going to read it. The Survivor. I, 24, led to slaughter. Oh, sorry. I am 24, led to slaughter, I survived. The following are empty synonyms: man and beast, love and hate, friend and foe, darkness and light. The way of killing men and beasts is the same. I've seen it. Truckfuls of chopped up men who will not be saved. Ideas are mere words. Virtue and crime, truth and lies, beauty and ugliness, courage and cowardice. Virtue and crime weigh the same. I've seen it in a man who is both criminal and virtuous. I seek a teacher and a master. May he restore my sight, my hearing and speech. May he again name objects and ideas. May he separate darkness from light. I am 24, led to slaughter, I survived. Sergio Rosevich, a very popular Polish poet. I don't know.
We're putting the
Whether,
question
you know,
out.
you're putting the question out. Do you detect any optimism in Rosevich's poem? He seeks a teacher. Primo Levy says we all have to be teachers.
We've got,
Yes, he
Mary,
Cheryl,
can you read some
yeah,
of those chats, please?
we've got Cheryl right here, so why don't we go right up here to Cheryl. Okay.
So,
So, Cheryl, the human hand, 27 bones, 35 muscles, about 2,000 nerve cells in each of the 5 tips of our fingers. That suffices to write Mein Kampf or House at Poe Corner.
and I think she meant Pooh, you know, like
Pooh Corner,
Winnie
yeah.
the Pooh, right?
Yeah, and Randy, yes, Randy says seeking understanding and definitions, clarity. And that, is that optimism, Randy? I'm just interested to, you know, I don't know. It would be an interesting thought here. Any other thoughts on what might be read as optimism? Who's the poet? We've already got the poet there. Right. Any other
Is
thoughts
there
on what makes it optimism? Right, yeah. Or do we
any?
detect it? I mean, Gail, I wonder if your question almost, is it
not?
something that just doesn't leave you so bleak? I don't know if we want to, I don't know if optimism is too strong a word for it. Let's hear what others have to say here. Okay. Got Morgan, amazing. Because it's never ending. Knowledge is hope, change. And here's Amy, who does a great deal of work with poetry and arts, and not on visual today, but on but all 4 days she sees the you know, some of the optimism. Amy, I wonder if you could elaborate a little on that. Are you able to? I don't even know if you're able to come up on this.
Dr. Johnson, I think that was at the beginning of the
Yes.
chat. Yeah, you might have to
Okay.
scroll down a little bit.
But Morgan, could you read us your response, because it's excellent?
Oh, thank you very much. No, I just said, Jackie, thank you for reading that poem, because I think my comment was that I think is that he's asking us to decide, decide what is maybe not unclear, but to weigh the options of that are presented before us, to choose between dark and light, right and wrong, to see the glass half empty or half full. And I think that depends on the individual's experience, but in terms of optimism, I'm not sure. But I think that's what he's maybe asking us to make a decision about.
Right.
And Nancy Carell, if you could put in the chat box, says that she has a hopeful lesson and book. So if you could give us the title and the author, we would really appreciate that. And let us know if that book has poetry in it. Thank you. Can you please, Jackie, briefly discuss, this is from Tom Sheridan, one of our high school teachers. Can you briefly discuss the lines of, consider if this is a man, and consider if this is a woman in Levy's poem?
Yeah, I'm just going back to it. Oh, it's up on the screen.
It's still up, I believe. Yeah.
I think what Primo Levy is doing there is describing, yeah, I didn't point that out exactly. The middle part, the middle section of the poem is his description of the Holocaust. You know, from consider whether this is a man, exactly from there, who labours in the mud, who knows no peace, who fights for a crust of bread, who dies at a yes or no. Is life in the concentration camp universe that knows all this, mud, no crust, no bread to eat. You die at a yes or no. Is that a man? Is this a man? If this is a man is the name of the book that he wrote. That's the name of the book in Italian, because he wrote Italian, right? If this is a man. Consider whether this is a woman. She's had her hair shaved off. Nobody had names in the Holocaust. If you were in Auschwitz, a number. You've got no more strength to remember everything, and everything is empty in your womb, cold as a frog in winter. So the woman and the man in the story of the Holocaust, according to Primo Levy's presentation here, in those 8, 9, 10 lines in the middle of the poem, is his presentation of what Nazis did to humanity in the camps. They lost their identity as human beings. And that's what I think the explanation of Primo Levi is for, consider whether this is a man. And he's saying they weren't, they were denuded of their humanity. And the woman, the same thing.
We have several comments on, with the woman, is it the physical that's being questioned here too? And especially like the loss of hair, et cetera. I think Karen's pointed this out. And is that what he's getting at there?
It's certainly part of it.
Right.
It's not only the physical, it's
But I think it's more than the physical, isn't it? I mean,
it's much more than just the physical. It's your total identity that was destroyed by they attempted to destroy your total identity as a human being, first physically and then slowly mentally as well. You know, there was a word invented in German for the person who's got no will left to live, Musulman, the Musulman. And they tried to turn people into the camps into Musulmen, and then they just took them off to the crematoria, the gas chambers.
I would like to add that Nancy Gorell highly recommends Light from the Yellow Star, A Lesson of Love from the Holocaust by Dr. Robert Fish, who is a Hungarian survivor. And she was responding to a hopeful ending, hopeful lesson plans. And perhaps there's some poems in this book, but if not, I encourage you to look at that. Light from the Yellow Star by Dr. Robert Fish, F-I-S-C-H.
Gail, I'm wondering, instead of just asking for the hopeful pictures to end with, is part of it, and I think it comes out so strongly with what Jackie is pointing out to us and what we're reading, that it makes us reflect much more on who we are as human beings, which might then lead to maybe not the hopeful, but really sort of thinking about who we are, what we can do. It may not be trying to give us a rosy picture, but certainly something, and I think that's what so many of these pieces are pushing us to do. Jackie, I just wonder as we come to a close here, could you comment a little bit on how using the poetry, I see it as so interdisciplinary. I mean, if you, certainly with the literature, but I can see it, have you ever worked with, from other disciplines, or do you share that at Yad Vashem, where you'll bring in the philosophy, you bring in religion, you bring in theology, all these different disciplines coming in as you're working with this? I'm just wondering how you have, sometimes you can do that, or if you do that.
Mary, we do that. If I have to give, well, things are closed down at the moment, but when we have groups of teachers from different countries and they come for seminars of 10 days to Yad Vashem, then I'll use the website in the classroom and I'll give a poem and I'll put up a painting and I'll put up a photograph, and we might see a short video and or a piece of prose we'll read, and we'll try and make it as interdisciplinary as possible. Because we know that our students work from different parts of their brains and from different parts of their bodies. They're absorbing information from this side, from that side, from this, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, for sure, using philosophy as well. I mean, going to at the limits of the mind is definitely an attempt by Jean Amery to penetrate via some philosophical ideas. The idea of torture, even, one chapter on torture. So yes, interdisciplinary is very important for us.
And it's really, oh, I'm sorry, Gail. Yeah, go ahead.
I just would like to make sure that we include Ellen Bernstein's comment, which is feeds into what we call across the curriculum. That's basically what you were both talking about. With my 5th graders, this is from Ellen, I have them read certain poems, but then write their own poem about their life, the ups and downs, and how they now reflect on how fortunate they truly are. Or perhaps, and I want to add to that, that I find that so many of my students are immigrants or undocumented, living in fear of ICE coming to their house. I could go through the so-called list of fears that our students have. So of not living in safe places, particularly now during this pandemic. So many of them, Jackie, do relate to the poetry and some of the circumstances that are mentioned in the poems. Of course, it's not exactly the same. And we never want to have what we call the Olympics of suffering, that, oh, my suffering is worse than yours. But certainly the themes and the topics are, which I'm going to transition into thanking Mary. And Mary, do you have a quick conclusion that you would like to share with us?
Yes, just that everyone is now sharing their own thoughts of how they're using the poetry. I think for all of us, and I so thank Jackie for this, it brings to light some of the core issues that we want to talk about that we can get with the poetry. And many of us have had the opportunity, if we just use one, that so sticks with the students. But I want to remind everyone, on the Yad Vashem site, the toolbox with Jackie Metzger's, I don't know how you call that, is excellent. And you've actually got pieces from the works that he's just shown, some of the works we've just seen there. It's excellent. I wonder if Irvin could put up that URL for us of the toolbox.
We'll put it in the chat box.
Yeah,
and Jackie, I'd like to turn it over to you if you have a conclusion for us. But Jackie, from the heart, you've moved me today. Our participants have been incredible. Thank you. Rachel, thank you for bringing your baby to our, please put his name in the chat box for us. He is like one of the cutest, bringing your baby to our seminar today. That's all the advantages of using Zoom. And Jackie, would you conclude the seminar, please, for us?
Ooh. I'd like to conclude it by being invited again to continue. It's very difficult to conclude a thing like this, but if I manage to open a window or two on another way to remember, I'm happy. Because I think that getting to the individual voice, which is what Alperfault wrote about right at the beginning, the second piece that I brought, will prevent this period from going into the cold storage of history. Back to Henri and his friends.
And Jackie,
so thank you very much for tuning in. And I'm just going to say this, and then I'm going to have a whiskey.
Oh
Gail.
my goodness! And for dinner. We
Well,
want to make sure everybody knows that it's dinner time in Jerusalem with maybe a falafel. Okay.
I want to say the following. Teaching, I think, is one of the hardest professions in the world. Teaching, I think, is also one of the most important professions in the world. And the fact that most of you people have adopted that approach to life and that profession, and it's not because it brings in such a tremendous salary, probably in your country the same as our country here. It's because you feel the necessity of what Primo Levy said himself. So in Hebrew we say kol hakavod, with all good respect to you people for choosing a wonderful, honorable profession. Good luck.
Thank you.